Hello, YouTubers. Welcome back to World History, AP World History Vocabulary. We're going to be looking at Russia between 1750 and 1900. And the two major things we're going to be looking at with Russia are essentially political reforms and what Russia was doing in order to try to please the people of Russia into believing that they were reforming from a all-powerful czarist regime, which was this autocratic monarchy, which was still ruling in Russia at the time, even when other Western societies were moving toward limited monarchs or straight-up constitutional democracies. And then the second one is industrialization and movement toward modifying or modernizing the nation. So we'll start politically with the Decembrist uprising. We'll look at the Crimean War and what that did to Russia during the time period. We'll look at the emancipation of the serfs, as well as Zemstvos. We will look at the Trans-Siberian Railroad and its benefits to Russia at the time. And then pogroms against the Jews in Russia toward the end of this time period, and then ending with Lenin and his Marxist vision for Russia with his Bolshevik Party, and then finally finishing with the Russo-Japanese War and the revolution in 1905, which essentially was the beginning of the end for the Russian Tsardom. So instead of going through a list of all the Russian czars, we'll kind of just start from the beginning. It's all Nicholases and Alexanders at this point until we get to the end of the czarist regime in Russia. We'll just kind of look at what was being done by these czars in order to try to preserve their power, their autocratic power, while at the same time appeasing the population and making them believe that Russia was changing. So we'll start with the Decembrist uprising. The Decembrist uprising happened in 1825. It was shortly after the invasion of Russia by Napoleon. Now, Napoleon didn't win. Napoleon was sent back to France, and humiliated and battered, and eventually was exiled from France, but he did bring with him the ideas of a constitutional government. The Napoleonic Code and his ideas of law and government did transfer to some of the people in Russia. So this Decembrist uprising was an attempt by some of the higher up military officials in Russia to change the government into a constitutional type of government. The Decembrist uprising or revolt failed. The Tsar was able to tighten down, and as a matter of fact, as a result of this failure, the Tsar became even more paranoid, and the power of the Tsar kind of grew, and the secret police became more prevalent, and state control of media and news was used as well in order to stop any more political changes from happening. In fact, they made it through most of the 19th century without major political revolts, and those that did happen were put down fairly easily. So it inspired some, but it also inspired conservatism on the part of the czars. The Crimean War was also rather alarming to the Russian ruling class. The Crimean War was essentially a battle for, I use the word essentially a lot, don't I? I do. The Crimean War was a battle for land on kind of the buffer zone between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire in the northern Black Sea, the Crimean Peninsula, which is currently in the news, involving Russia once again. Well, the Crimean Peninsula was inhabited by the Ukrainian peoples who were there and a number of others, but the Russians were attempting to take it. They were stopped in this maneuver by not only the Ottoman Empire, but also the French and the British, who didn't want to see the Russian Empire growing any larger. And they were stopped, not necessarily really easily, but they definitely lost to a much superior military in terms of strategy, but also and mainly in terms of industrialized military machine. And so this kind of provided Russia with the impetus to start to industrialize and at least further their efforts to become a more industrialized country, especially with regard to the military. One of the other things they did shortly after this was the emancipation of the serfs, and this was a basically a political move in order to give the peasants, the serfs in Russia, something to look forward to. Instead of being serfs and tied to the land, they were now able to farm their own plots of land, which they could pay the government for, and be wage-earning citizens. It didn't result in massive changes in labor. Most people were still rural farm workers, um, but it did at least on the surface show that Russia was trying to reform. At the same time, they also introduced zemstvos, which were local political groups, essentially like a city council, which had some control over local issues. So local roads and laws and rules and education, but had no voice at the national level. So the Tsar wouldn't take advice. This wasn't a parliament by any means. It was just a group of local political rulers. So the Zemstvos and the Emancipation of the Serfs were two reform efforts, at least, and while they were very minor, they were something that made the people of Russia a little bit hopeful that there was change on the horizon. At the same time, the Tsars continued to have pretty heavy-handed power. So one of the things that they did in order to industrialize and further their economy was the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And the Trans-Siberian Railroad was finished to connect Moscow with the eastern Siberian region all the way to Vladivostok, which is on the east coast of Russia, and was really good for transportation of not only people, but in order to inhabit the region and develop the region, but also to move coal and iron and even grain in so they could start exporting grain to the west. And then it furthered their contact with Asia, with China and Japan, who they would get involved with as well. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So the Trans-Siberian Railroad was an important development industrially. A setback in Russia, a very nationalist movement, was when the Russians started to attack the Jews in Russia. And the Jews in Russia were attacked using pogroms. These pogroms were targeted attacks on Jewish populations, essentially limiting the rights of Jewish people in Russia in an attempt to move them out or confine them and essentially discriminate against the Jews in Russia. So these pogroms against the Jews in Russia resulted in a lot of Jewish people leaving Russia and moving usually into Western Europe in order to find a place that was a little safer for a Jewish population to live. So The Fiddler on the Roof, toward the end of this time period, is a good movie to watch if you're looking at the Russian oppression or basically pogroms against Jews to move them out. Lastly, let's look at Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Vladimir Lenin was a Marxist who believed that a revolution was coming to Russia and tailored the revolution to Russia in order to essentially turn Russia communist. Now, his party wasn't necessarily very powerful at first. The party was called the Bolshevik Party. It meant the majority party. But the people were attracted to his ideas, especially the working class, who saw this as a chance to strike back against the elites, the ruling class, and take power for the workers. So Lenin began kind of agitating for political change in the early 1900s, and after the Russian Revolution in 1917 would take full power. But first there was a minor revolution, the revolution in 1905, which was prompted by the loss to the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. So the Russo-Japanese War was an imperial battle against the Russians and the Japanese in Korea, and the Russians won handily, and the Japanese won handily, and the Russians were defeated yet again, and this sparked a series of protests and outrage, and the national government attempted to reform. They created a national parliament, but it didn't really do much. The Tsar Nicholas II at this time was still holding on to his autocratic power, and the Russian system, the old Russian Tsarist system, was beginning to crumble. So we're not going to get into the Russian Revolution in 1917 at this point, or really Russia's involvement in World War I, because we're going to save that for the next unit. But essentially by 1900, the Tsarist regime was done, although Russia had made major gains in industrializing. So while their autocratic power was going down, their industrial power was going up. All right. Let's continue with Japan in tomorrow's video, and that'll be the only one that I go off of in this chapter before doing a little review of the entire unit. And I hope you continue to be awesome.